the majority of the world's countries are not democracies. So to have this notion sitting in Washington or Westminster that, well, we can only engage democracies, it means you're essentially talking about let's engage North America, Europe, 3 or 4 countries in Asia, 2 or 3 countries in Africa, a bit of Latin America, but you're leaving out wide swaths of the world in a way that I think would be really unwise.
This is The Global Gambit.
This time around, we're going kind of thematical. So we're going to be talking about dictators. Why you should stick around, simply because we're going to be talking about strongmen. Now, not strongmen in the sense of how much weight they can pull, deadlift, but more in the sense of an autocratic leader. But is that even the right interpretation? To break down some of these themes and more, Charles Dunst. Pleasure to have you on. Charles is Deputy Director of Research and Analysis at the Asia Group, a fantastic organization that I do refer to for lots of things Indo-Pacific, Asian related. But he's also an adjunct fellow at CSIS, of which we've had fellow speakers on from before, and one of the think tanks that I consider to be very respectable in a multitude of areas, and that actually some of my former professors came from. He's also the author of Defeating Dictators, How Democracy Can Prevail in the Age of the Strongman. Links to all of these will be in the description below. Very excited to see the DC skyline in the backdrop there. I've just got a bathroom door or whatever it is behind me. I guess kicking off really is what inspired the book. I know there's a lot of political stuff, but take us a bit about the book and your motivations behind it.
Yeah, I mean, it's a bit of a funny story because in a previous life, I was a journalist in Southeast Asia. And that was my first job at 22, 23 years old. I was writing for the New York Times and the Atlantic on kind of Southeast Asian politics, was based in Cambodia, doing Cambodia, Vietnam, Myanmar, traveled a bunch to places like Singapore. And then I was in London, where I kind of moved to do my master's at the London School of Economics. I was working part-time, was still kind of a journalist. And I knew I wanted to write some kind of book, but honestly, I thought it was going to be a Vietnam book, a Southeast Asia book. And I kind of was working at the LSE's foreign policy think tank and ended up through that meeting an agent. And the agent and I went back and forth saying, yeah, I want to do a book on how the Vietnam War kind of ruined US foreign policy. And that's something I was really interested in. I wrote a whole long proposal, like 150, 250 footnotes, really intense. And all the publishers were like, why would anybody want to read this? It's too dense. It's academic. You've no stories. And they were right. I mean, I had no idea kind of how I was supposed to write a book. But long story short, Hodder and Stoughton, a kind of great British publishing house, reached out to my agent and said, well, we're interested in something kind of on autocracy, democracy, something a little bit different. We want to do it really quickly, maybe not for a ton of money, someone with a little bit of a newer profile, someone who's new ideas. I mean, do you know anyone who could do it, who could shape it, and who could write it really fast? And that kind of came to me because my agent kind of knew I could write really quickly, knew I was thinking about these issues. And the book really came about in response to some travel I did to places like Singapore, and then living in, obviously, I'm American, but living in the US, living in the UK, living in Hungary, living in Cambodia, and kind of hearing people say, well, why does it look like the democracies are kind of collapsing? Why do you have such chaos in US politics and UK politics? Or even why does Singapore seem to work so much better than Germany? Or why does the UAE seem to work so much better than France? And hearing people kind of talk about the successes of these small, rich autocracies, and even less so now, but more 3 or 4 years ago, the kind of successes of China economically, and thinking, well, what do we have to do to restore the shine to democracy? What do we have to do to make democracy work so much better that people in democracies are no longer looking to the UAE or Singapore for inspiration? Because I think when people are open to that kind of illiberal government with the notion of, well, I'm happy to give up some of my freedoms for more money, that's a really dangerous scenario. And I think sets the stage for the rise of an autocracy kind of vis-a-vis Hungary.
Yeah, no, very interesting. And what you touch upon there is directly what I want to go into, which is Biden has framed, at least early on in his administration, this notion of autocracy versus democracy battle, tug of war. And for listeners, you've known at this point that I like to try and put things on a spectrum, and one of those things is the level of democratization a state has. So on one extreme, you have totalitarianism, North Korea, you can argue, and on another side, I don't know what's a full democracy, New Zealand or something like that, right? There is no, I guess, full theoretical democracy, but and then you've got all these hybrid regimes, and you've mentioned Singapore, which is a fascinating case study, as is somewhere like Kazakhstan, and China in itself. Some of these things can be called competitive authoritarian regime. Some of them can be called illiberal democracies, as you mentioned, Hungary. So I guess two-part question is, how much do you agree with Biden's notion of democracy versus autocracy? Or is it a bit simplistic, which I've heard other academics and analysts, people say, particularly in the concept of Ukraine? And then second, how do you go about illustrating those themes, the themes along this line in the book?
Yeah, I mean, I think on the autocracy democracy framing, I will say in the Asia space, in the Asia kind of policy world in DC, people are not super positive on it because obviously, if you're saying simultaneously, I'm going to deepen ties with Southeast Asia, that's a priority, but also Southeast Asia is majority non-democracies. So it's how do you actually kind of put those two together? And especially when you have this kind of list of who's a democracy, who's not, it frustrates anyone who's left out. So certainly Singapore was not thrilled to be left out. I mean, Vietnam knows it's not a democracy, but even still trying to engage the United States, it feels like it's an exclusive club that you then don't get let into. So the implementation of that, I think, was probably frustrating for some people, but I don't have a problem with the framing. And I think the framing, in my understanding, is not actually driven so much by Biden's staffers. It seems to be very much be driven by the president himself, seems to very much believe in this and tie it to, it's not about China. I mean, it really is tying to domestic democratic renewal. And I think he campaigned on righting so many of the wrongs, the perceived wrongs of the previous administration, thinking about things like Charlottesville. And I think for the president and for his top aides, there's a very clear connection between saying, look what happened in Charlottesville. Look about how we're reinvigorating American democracy. And here's how we need to promote that vision abroad through this framing, through things like the Summit for Democracy, where we're sharing best practices on counter corruption and on all these things. So I think the framing is fine. I think the question is, how do you manage the frustrations it's going to inevitably elicit from non-democratic partners? And I think they've done a pretty good job at it, honestly, where, Singaporeans get maybe irritated for a day or two. The Vietnamese get frustrated for a week. But, both of them are still close U.S. partners. Biden hosted Singapore's prime minister at the White House somewhere within the last year. He's met senior Vietnamese leaders. I think there's just a key balance of figuring out, well, we are framing this as democracy versus autocracy. We believe in the need to strengthen democracy where it already exists in terms of best practices. And, if there are opportunities to promote democracy abroad, we will try. But we are also not looking to topple the governments of Singapore or Vietnam, and we are looking to cooperate with them where possible. And it's a tough line to kind of draw, I think a tough needle to thread to say, well, we believe in democracy, we want to support democracy where possible, but we also understand the need to have autocratic partners. And that doesn't bother me at all. It's something I said very explicitly in the book, where the majority of the world's countries are not democracies. So to have this notion sitting in Washington or Westminster that, well, we can only engage democracies, it means you're essentially talking about, let's engage North America, Europe, 3 or 4 countries in Asia, 2 or 3 countries in Africa, a bit of Latin America, but you're leaving out wide swaths of the world in a way that I think would be really unwise. I think it's just making sure that you are maintaining your values in those relationships with autocracies, where I would say we probably do a better job on that with the Singapore or even with the Vietnam than maybe with Saudi Arabia. That also helps that Singapore and Vietnam don't have the human rights records of Saudi Arabia. So it's an issue, and each country exists on a spectrum, as I think you were saying before, that there is no United States or UK policy towards autocracy. There are only policies towards specific autocracies. So obviously we're going to have different relationships with Vietnam and Singapore than we do with Saudi Arabia and Russia. So that's kind of how I think about that framing and those issues.
I see. So what you say there makes me think of the image of the map. And when we say international community, and suddenly like 3/4 of the map is just blank, and it's North America, Europe, and sometimes not even all of Europe, just Western Europe, and Australia and New Zealand, Japan, and that's about it. So no, so that makes me think then a little bit There's a couple of recent examples that I'd love you to use as a way to sort of illustrate what you're getting at in the book, which is Biden's comments in the run up to running for presidency, making Saudi Arabia a pariah state. Oh dear. And what did he have to do? He had to go basically with his tail between his legs and, with the Saudis on that Middle Eastern trip. Don't do the whole OPEC thing. Don't reduce oil. And what have we been seeing? Saudi Arabia making MBS making remarkable diplomatic maneuvers around the Middle East. I mean, I'm still struggling to keep up with the fact that we supposedly normalization with Iran, improvement of relations with Israel, even Turkey and Saudi Arabia talking again. It's so much is happening. So there's that illustration, but then obviously Turkey itself. And we've now got seemingly the other angle, which is Erdogan has won. He's back in power for the next few years, but we just had the NATO summit, and he was quite. Some people went as far as to say that he's turning westwards, which I think is rubbish. I wouldn't say that he's an ally of the West. I think Turkey's still a problematic NATO partner, or at least from the US perspective, it is. But what do you think about recent examples of sort of strong men doing what they do so well? What's your thoughts on that, and how do you see what plays out in the real world, illustrated in what you've written?
I think it's a clear demonstration to me that a kind of the problem, a little bit of an autocratic system where you are betting that your strongman will be a competent one and will not kind of run the country into the ground. And I think in Turkey and Saudi Arabia, you have very different examples where MBS has made, remarkable mistakes abroad in terms of the Khashoggi assassination, kind of the war in Yemen, all these things that did not help Saudi Arabia's national interest. But he's very focused on domestic development. He's very focused on bringing in new revenue streams as the country transitions away from oil production, thinking about things like, purchasing a Premier League team, investing in green energy. There are all these things he's trying to do to basically set up his country for the future in a way that I think maybe Turkey is not, where Erdogan, sure, is maybe now playing a little bit of a bigger player on the international stage, but its economy is terrible. I mean, its economy is kind of tanked because Erdogan has, for the past kind of half decade, ignored economic orthodoxy, and now has inflation in the 60%, I think 40%, something along those lines. So they strike me as very different, very, very different, obviously very different systems, where MBS faces no real competition, where obviously Erdogan, it's a competitive quasi democracy where he could in theory lose. But those two countries are pretty clear demonstrations to me of, well, what happens when you have someone who's actually at least a little bit focused on economic development and kind of progress in one way or another, despite massive errors. Whereas someone like Erdogan, it seems most focused on just kind of retaining his own power with limited concern for the general public. Neither one of those countries, I think, is particularly well governed. I mean, when I think of an example of a quote unquote well governed autocracy, it really is Singapore. And Singapore is the exception. I think it's the best governed autocratic state that exists today. I think you can probably include, to some extent, you can put the UAE in that conversation a little bit. And that's also because I think the UAE is just a little more savvy in terms of projecting its image than the Saudis are, honestly. I think it's just a reminder to me that the way you're in a strongman system, you're betting that your one leader will be incredibly smart and incredibly good, because if they're not, you have no way to get rid of them. And that has kind of been a little bit of the Turkey story, although, in theory he could lose. But I do think about the kind of classic problem of, well, if MBS were to disappear from the scene, who replaces him? Would that person be more or less competent? It's kind of an ongoing problem where, think about Russia. Well, if Putin's gone, who would replace him? Is it someone more Western friendly or more anti-Western? Probably someone more anti-Western. Whereas obviously in a democracy, if the US president comes in and is really incompetent for 4 years, they get voted out. And that's your kind of accountability. But the lack of accountability in autocratic systems, I think, often sets the stage for poor policy, even if there is maybe rapid implementation of the policy because there are lacks of checks and balances. But it's kind of a classic reminder to me of the way in which the lacks of checks and balances and the lack of accountability combine to sometimes produce really bad policy in autocracy.
No, that is exactly what I'm thinking as well. And you mentioned about Putin. I mean, well, that's been entertaining for some of us in the past few weeks with what happened with the mutiny. With what you saw there, we've seen again quite a varied amount of interpretations. Some people saying that this is the end of Putin, he's done. I don't go that far. Then, on the other extreme, that this entire thing was staged, like every intricate detail was staged. I think that's absolute rubbish. There may have been some internal dealings with getting Lukashenko to help negotiate a deal, but I'm more in the middle of, I think this has made Putin fragile more than he's ever looked. And for me personally, being from that part of the world, partially, Putin for me is a quintessential example of a strong man. And a lot of what Bolsonaro has looked at Putin, so has Erdogan. As you say, I sort of consider Erdogan's Turkey as Putin as Russia light, right? Sure. They have elections and they're quite close, but there's definitely, I don't think they're fair, and I think there's a fair amount of shady dealings going on whilst within Russia it's a semi-presidential republic. Yes, the United Russia Party has been in power since 2099. What I love is the official opposition, so everybody, including the communists and the Liberal Democratic Party, which is ultra nationalists, agree exactly the same on what Putin's doing is great, aside from what happened in Ukraine in last year. But he's doing the perfect thing. We absolutely agree with everything, even though we're the opposition and have completely different ideological interpretations. Okay, so how do you feel about Putin's particularly?
I think the way Putin went about invading Ukraine was such a reminder of the way in which autocratic systems are not set up for good policymaking. Whereas he surrounded himself either with aides who were incompetent, because obviously when you're the top guy, you surround yourself with incompetent people because you feel that, well, if I'm the president, I surround myself with someone who's also really smart and really, really intelligent and really well connected, maybe they'll move to oust me. So as a result, you often see kind of top leaders of authoritarian countries surround themselves with quite incompetent people. The result of that is either no one knew that the war in Ukraine was going to go poorly, or they were so scared of Putin that they weren't able to tell him. Either way, there was a complete lack of feedback loops that are necessary to produce good policy. So he thought he was going to march into Kyiv and oust Zelensky in a week, and this thing would be over. And the fact that it hasn't, and the fact that he had no idea, A, how strong the Ukrainian military was going to be, and B, how weak the Russian military was, were just totally reflective of that lack of feedback loops in the top of most authoritarian systems. And the fact that the military was so broken is also a reminder of the way in which it's really difficult in authoritarian systems to maintain effective institutions, because they're crippled by corruption, they're crippled by these patronage networks. I mean, surely there are people, I think there were stories that a bunch of these Russian soldiers had taken some of the parts of their advanced weaponry and sold them on the private market, and then they were left with kind of ineffective weapons. That's not something that happens in a kind of accountable democracy. So that is my most obvious takeaway from the way in which the war in Ukraine has gone, is that it's a total reminder of the way in which, when you have one man running the system, that one man, and it is almost always a man, not a woman, can make incredibly bad policy decisions based on incredibly flawed intelligence that produces mistakes like Ukraine. And now, because it's an authoritarian system and all the decisions are his and his alone, there's no real way for him to back out of it without losing face. You pull out of Ukraine, you've kind of lost your ultra-nationalist support, which is now, across the general public, based on kind of what the education of the public to be super nationalist, which is what they call kind of patriotic education in China. But he's kind of stuck in this catch-22 of going into an incredibly just dumb war based on poor intelligence or a lack of intelligence, performing poorly, but not being able to pull out because he's primed his public to be so ultra-nationalist. And how the mutiny fits in is above my Russia credentials. I mean, I definitely don't think it was staged. I am very confused by the kind of somewhat the negotiation and the deal reached. It seems unusual to me that Putin is kind of known to be pretty ruthless with his opponents, would just kind of let Prigozhin hang around for a while. But it seems like, based on reports elsewhere, that Wagner is still kind of carrying out Russian interests in parts of Africa. So it seems like things are back to kind of quote unquote whatever the Russian normal is, but maybe not, not necessarily in the longer term.
Yeah, I mean, on the whole point about a large array to do with Africa, and we're going to be having a conversation about that, viewers, what implications does the mutiny have for operations of Wagner in Africa? Because I'm beginning to see, from my observations, a growing discontent, unsettledness among certain governments in Africa about Wagner's effectiveness, because they thought, oh, come in, it'll be really effective. But the point is, if Wagner does its job well, and gets rid of the security concerns, well, then they're out of a job. So they need to do their job well enough that they are employed, but not well enough that they, well, do the job. So it's this weird paradigm. Burkina Faso is a perfect case of this. But it's colleagues of yours actually, Charles, at CSIS. From what I recall, they're talking about the effectiveness of strongmen, of certain leaders, and this does make me wonder. Are we? I guess how I ask you simply is: are we seeing a strengthening or a weakening of strongmen in the traditional sense? We've got Trump being indicted, we've got Bolsonaro potentially in trouble over the Jan 8th attempted coup in Brazil. As I say, Erdogan is sort of seemingly playing the game a little bit more delicately over NATO now. Are we seeing a return of solid democracy, or am I simplifying it too much?
I mean, it's really interesting because I think this answer is very different. When I started writing the book, when I finished the book, and now today. Whereas the book came out in early 2023, which means I guess it was completed about a year ago now. So kind of completed, draft done July of 2022. And that's a very different kind of period actually than we existed now, where I think 2022 and so far in 2023 has actually been a pretty good year for democracy, where I think the G7 is the strongest it's been in a long time. NATO is the strongest it's been in a long time. EU-US ties are incredibly close and only getting closer. There have been agreements on really key issues, even things like data sharing between them that had been a problem before. There's the strengthening of ties in Northeast Asia between Japan and South Korea that I think was completely unexpected. And that's been not so much brokered by the United States. The United States is kind of encouraged, but those two countries alone have, the leaders are working to get over a really complicated history. And those are two of the kind of key democracies in Asia. Of course, Australia and New Zealand kind of remain strong partners. And in the developing world, you've seen some positive steps, where in the Philippines, the son of a dictator came into power and has actually been reasonably good. I mean, it's not to say that the human rights record in the Philippines is perfect by any means, but he won a free and fair election, has rapidly kind of deepened ties to the United States and with Japan, kind of both together and trilaterally, out of fears of China. And it's not that he's not welcoming trade with China, but he's much less China aligned than Duterte was. And he's much better on domestic governance than Duterte was. And he is very focused, based on kind of conversations I've picked up and whatever. It seems like he's very focused on issues like labor. He's very focused on issues like minimum wage, kind of all these things that are actually good for democracy. And that's in the Philippines, which is not exactly a paradigm of democratic kind of governance. Something similar happened in Malaysia, where Malaysia had this massive corruption scandal with former Prime Minister Najib, and then they put him in prison. And everyone said, oh, he'll get pardoned. Malaysia's corrupt, he'll get pardoned. And he hasn't been pardoned, he's still been in prison. And they've had democratic elections. They have a coalition government in place right now that's a little shaky, but is stable for the first time in a while. Those are not, and obviously in Brazil, even if Lula has now kind of been a little more pro-Russia than people would like, he defeated someone who otherwise would have been a strongman, and clearly that is a good thing for democracy. So I think 2022 and early 2023 have been really good years for democracy, notwithstanding the victory and Erdogan's victory in Turkey, notwithstanding the fact that you still have Viktor Orban in the middle of Europe. And I used to live in Hungary, and it's incredibly frustrating to me because I don't think Hungary is a democracy at the moment. I think he has gerrymandered the system too much, or changed the judicial system too much, or clamped down on free press, all these things in a way that I don't think it meets a democratic standard, liberal or illiberal. But there are certainly some kind of black spots like that. But I think the trends are overall positive. There have been some positive pushes for democracy. I think ultimately, though, and this is not anything new, the big question will really be around the election next year. I don't really work on domestic U.S. politics, the U.S. election next year. I don't really work on U.S. domestic politics. I don't have a ton of particularly insightful things beyond what you might hear on CNN. But clearly, it's going to be the biggest issue in 2024 for a bunch of America's partners and just the West broadly. I mean, if you're sitting in Australia or Westminster or Berlin or South Korea, you would much prefer, I imagine, a Biden type presidency, or kind of standard bearer Republican, like a Mitt Romney type, to the return of President Trump. And I think that
use that kind of word, or convention.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think an establishment, or even even someone who's a little bit more predictable on international affairs, because obviously international affairs have generally been pretty bipartisan, or even now, I think US policy, with the exception of maybe some of the kind of the far right and the far left, are pretty united on Ukraine, on NATO, on G7. And I think so. I think that's the big question for 2024. I will also say 2024 is going to be a big election year in many big democracies, where you have the US, you have the UK, you have India. You're going to have a Japan election. There's certainly a few others. You're going to have Indonesia. I mean, it's a lot of big elections that could see a lot of change.
So, Charles, one of the things that does make me think about this in a slightly perhaps different angle is a growing concern about the type of democracies. As I mentioned at the beginning, you've got a lot of interpretations, a full democracy, a flawed democracy, to quote Freedom House. And one of the concerns I think many people have, and whilst I know this is not strictly associated to strong men, is the deterioration of the type of democracies that we have, right? United States has seen a decrease several years consistently, I think, in the quality of its democracy.
Sure.
India, when we've had previous speakers like Professor Dan Markey from United States Institute of Peace, it is a democracy, but is it a liberal democracy? And as you said, we've got a lot of important elections next year. I'm in London. I am not happy with the state of this country because we've had the same party in power for 10 years, 12 years. And whilst we've had different leaders in the sense of that party, a large proportion of it was driven through corruption, nepotism. I don't know. Boris Johnson was an abhorrent leader, in my opinion, for the United Kingdom. And whilst, again, he's not strictly speaking a strongman, he gave off certain sort of, you can be a narcissist. You don't have to be a narcissist, but you can illustrate narcissistic tendencies, is what I'm trying to say. So are there certain, again, a two-pronged question. One, are there certain characteristics or elements that can be prevalent in leaders, even if they're not categorized as a strongman? And two, what is your general feeling about the quality of democracies as it is? Are we concerned about a growing reduction in civil liberties amongst countries that we would consider democracies?
Sure. I mean, on the first question, I think there definitely are strongman tendencies in leaders who come to power, through democratic means. I mean, that is kind of the Trump story. It's the Bolsonaro story. It was, to some extent, early on, the Viktor Orban story, but these are all people who were not, didn't take power in a civil war, kind of like the strongman of generation previous, like the previous generation. These are people who won elections and then kind of tried to behave like they didn't operate in a democratic system. And I think Orban probably succeeded in transforming that system from a democratic one to a non-democratic one. And within that, I think your second question is very much related in terms of thinking about, well, am I concerned about the state of the quality of our democracies? And the answer is yes, because I think when your democracies decline in terms of public goods, in terms of your economy, in terms of, well, is my infrastructure good? Is my social safety net effective? Do I feel like the system is meritocratic? Do I feel like there's social mobility? The more questions like that you answer no, the more angry you will be as a voter in a democratic system. And I strongly believe the more angry you are there, the more open you will be to some type of new vision of politics. And that new vision of politics is increasingly the illiberal, vaguely anti-democratic positions that you see from Trump, you see from Bolsonaro, you see from Marine Le Pen in France. These are not people who can win elections if things are operating well. There is a reason why the kind of anti-establishment, I don't want to say anti-democratic, but illiberal politicians are kind of gaining steam at the same moment that you see people saying their quality of life is going down, that they have less expectations for their children.
Would you categorize them as populists? Or is that too?
I do, but I think the populist, I think those terms are used kind of in the wrong way, where I think populist and nationalist are used inevitably as kind of like poor terms, as negative terms, as almost pejoratives, which I think is not right. Like, you can be a good nationalist in the sense that you can believe your country is incredibly strong and that your country is unique and your country should be powerful without being an ethno-nationalist or without being kind of, nationalistic in a negative way. And I think on populism, people have described Bernie Sanders as populist. Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump are not the same are not two sides of the same coin, in my opinion. I mean, certainly, I don't think Bernie Sanders is anti-democratic or illiberal. So that's part of the reason why I prefer to use illiberal rather than populist or nationalist, because you can be a liberal populist, absolutely. You can be an illiberal populist. You can be a liberal nationalist. You can be an illiberal nationalist. I think the problem is the illiberalism, because when you are illiberal, it means to me you are more likely to be anti-democratic, and that's the problem. Where I'm less worried about a populist left-wing government coming into power in the United States or the United Kingdom and that somehow becoming anti-democratic. Whereas clearly, as you saw in Hungary, a liberal leader on the right wing comes into power and within 10, 11, 12 years, essentially does away with democracy. To me, at least in the United States, that's not as big as a concern. There's some fringe views in Europe that talk about like climate change is bigger than democracy. And it's, well, we need some type of climate strongman to do things like ban you from buying too many cars or ban you from going on too many vacations to bring down emissions. That's more a European problem, honestly, than an American problem. I just don't see that picking up steam
What
here.
if David Attenborough was the strongman?
Yeah, but what if David? I forget who it is, but it's these two. It's a French scholar, maybe a Danish scholar, who said something to the effect of like, "We need neo-Stalinism to handle climate change." And I'm like, well, neo-Stalinism means like neo-gulags. Like you're gonna have climate gulags if you buy too many cars or set your thermostat too high or too low, which I think is a separate problem.
Wow.
But I mean, I think the quality of a democracy is key to preserving that democracy. And I'm not the first one to make that point, but it is the reason why the book centers so much on providing good governance. It centers on things like meritocracy, accountability, social safety net, infrastructure, human capital, getting things right on immigration, all of these things that are pretty core to making the individual's experience in that democratic system better. Because if individuals do not feel like democracy is working for them, it's very hard to convince them, let alone convince people abroad that democracy is the model for them. It is not hard for me to understand why someone sitting in Hanoi might say, we'd be better off following Singapore's model than the United States' model. That's not a hard connection for me to make. Obviously, as an American, and obviously as someone who's lived both in autocracies and democracies, I believe quite strongly in democracy. I think democracy should win. I think democracy is better, even if per capita Americans are poorer than Singaporeans. I'd much rather be an American than a Singaporean, given all the ways in which democracy still produces the best innovations, the best culture, all of these things. But I think it really is critical to kind of getting one's house in order before really thinking about promoting democracy abroad. And I think that's part of the reason why President Biden has connected democracy abroad to America's democratic renewal and to even things like Charlottesville and kind of correcting those ills.
Yeah, it does make me think about the biggest threat to American democracy is not China, it's not Russia, it is itself, or the inability for it to get itself back to a place where it seemingly was better. But Charles, it's been a pleasure. Everybody, do check out the book. Really worth the read. I to be honest, I didn't get through all of it yet in time for our conversation because I was rereading bits that I'd already read and then go and refer to something else. And I was like, oh, that makes me think of that. And as I could tell from this enriched conversation, I think it is. I want to thank my patrons for who make this possible, particularly peeps like Matt. You know who you are. Thank you for your timely support. I look forward to the next conversation. Until then, ta-ra everyone.